Hey guys, so we are back to talk about not only monotransitive, intransitive, but also a third class of what we call ditransitive verbs. Because, if it were the case that there were only two classes of verb phrase, I probably wouldn't have a job. That's not very complicated. Things must be more complex. And they are. So, think about it this way. As long as you know what the terminology is referring to in linguistics, you can always, purely by logic, get to the right analysis. So that should be sort of a comforting thing. I remember I used to take a lot of courses in literature, and I always had the hardest time understanding, well, why would you give that analysis instead of giving a completely different analysis where you're talking about completely different ideas? What's the evidence that one analysis is the correct analysis? And I think I drove my professors crazy because they were like, there doesn't need to be one correct analysis. And that just did not fit in my brain. And that's the difference, I think, between people in literature and people in linguistics. People in literature are fine with, okay, here's one analysis, here's another analysis, here's yet a third, and we have a fourth. How rich this topic is. Whereas people who are in linguistics do not like that idea. They are not comfortable with that. There should be one way to analyze the sentence, which is the correct way to do it. And so learning linguistics is really just learning all about the ways that we can know what the structure of the sentence is. So I hope that's reassuring. I don't know, maybe it's not reassuring, but I hope that it's reassuring. So let's talk about the ditransitives. So the ditransitives are going to be our third type of verb phrase. And what we see with the ditransitives is that we have within the ditransitive verb phrase not only a direct object, but also what we're going to call the indirect object. So verb plus direct object plus the indirect object. So here we have a new term. What do we mean by indirect object? Well, we know what we mean by verb. We know that the direct object receives the action of the verb. The indirect object receives the direct object. Okay, so think about it that way. Just as the direct object receives the action of the verb, the indirect object receives the direct object. And we'll see how that works. So if you have a sentence like John gave the money to the robbers. John gave the money to the robbers. First thing you're going to ask yourself is, what are the two pieces of this sentence? This thing is functioning as a whole sentence. I know that the most basic parts of this sentence must be the subject and the predicate. And so when you look at this and you say, well, who is this sentence about? Who are we referring to? We're referring to John. So John's going to be the subject of the sentence. And then we've got gave the money to the robbers. Okay, what's going on here? So gave, we can see, is going to be our main verb. It's the only verb occurring here, so it has to be the main verb of the sentence. Every sentence in English has at least one verb. And if it has one verb, that verb is always the main verb. Okay? So you'll never have a sentence in English in which you have a verb that is anything other than the main verb. So for example, an auxiliary verb. You can only have an auxiliary verb if you already have a main verb. Okay, so John gave the money to the robbers. The money is taking the action of giving. right? Because it's the thing that was given. But when you think about to the robbers are the recipient of the money. They are the ones who get the money. But they are not the ones who are given to someone else. Even thinking about it that way sounds kind of weird, right? You say, you know, you could imagine a situation where it would make sense. You gave the robbers to the police or something like that. In that case, the robbers would be the direct object. They're the thing, or the people, the things that are being given to someone else. And then in that sentence, the police would be the indirect object because they receive the direct object. Okay? So ditransitive means you have main verb, direct object, indirect object. Another example would be the officer contributed books to the library. So we want to think first, the subject of our sentence, the officer. What are we saying about this subject? What is the information that the predicate is giving us? Well, we have contributed books to the library. Contributed is serving as our main verb. And then books, well, we know that books are the things that were contributed, right? So that makes it the direct object. It's receiving the action of the verb. They're the things being contributed. And then when we look at to the library, we think, okay, the library is now not being contributed. You know, it's not that someone is contributing a library to someone else, although that would be possible. But in this sentence, the library is receiving the books. So it's the recipient of the direct object. So if you sort of think about it that way, the ditransitives, the direct object always gets the action of the verb, and the indirect object always gets the direct object. It's the recipient of the direct object. Okay, so what's interesting about ditransitives is that when you have ditransitives in English, you have two different ways to express the sentence. They both mean the same thing. You know, you can choose either way to say it. You have both options. And the core meaning is going to be the same, but in this area of English, we just happen to have two different options. So for example, if we went to John gave the money to the robbers, how else could I have said that sentence? What if I said, John gave the robbers the money? John gave the robbers the money. Now notice that I have the robbers occurring after the verb, and then I have the money occurring after the robbers. John gave the robbers the money, but the meaning is still the same. So in other words, the robbers are the guys who are getting the money. The money is the thing that is being given, right? It's receiving the action of the verb. So when you have ditransitive structures, you have two alternative possibilities. They mean the same thing, but, you know, for whatever reason, we get two possible ways of saying it in English. If you have the child sent grandma a card, when you're thinking about analyzing these units of the sentence, always think about what meaning do they have in this particular sentence. That's going to tell you whether you have a direct object, you have an indirect object, you have no object, you have something that's going to be different from those, okay? So when you say the child sent grandma a card, first thing you want to do is, what are the two parts of the sentence? What's the subject and what's the predicate? You know that the subject is going to be the child, right? It's occurring at the very beginning of the sentence, which is where we expect it to occur in English. And then you have the rest of the sentence, sent grandma a card. Now when you think about the meaning of these expressions, sent grandma a card, Was grandma the thing that was sent? No. It's not that grandma is being sent someplace by the child. It's that the card is being sent. So in other words, the card is serving as the direct object. It receives the action of the verb. But what about grandma? What is she doing here? She's still serving as the indirect object, because when you say the child sent grandma a card, the card is sent by the child to grandma. And that's what we mean by saying that we have two different ways of saying these sentences, right? You could have chosen to say the child sent grandma a card. You could have also just chosen to say the child sent a card to grandma. It means exactly the same thing. It will only be ditransitives that will work this way. So that is one way that you can know if you're looking at a sentence and you're thinking to yourself, okay, what type of verb phrase do I have here? If you think it's ditransitive, then just check to see whether you have another way of saying the sentence. If you can move things around in the sentence and the meaning stays the same, then you know you're dealing with the ditransitive. Okay, we're going to go through lots and lots and lots and lots of examples. But I think you know there will be more types coming up very soon.